What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, it's transfer tips for game week 38, and I've done things a little bit differently to normal. Usually I go and look at the transfers in and out and select a few of the popular players to talk about, but instead I've gone to livefpl.net, which is a great website. You should check it out, and I've looked at the ownership levels of players in the top 100,000 to see who is a differential. So every single player you see in this video, and there's a lot more than there usually would be, is under 10% owned, apart from one, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, these ownership levels are based on game week 37. Of course, people can buy and sell players up until game week 38, so they might change a little bit, but this is the most accurate information we have. And even if you're not in the top 100,000, it's still a very good indicator. Now, just a couple of things to say. You don't necessarily need to be under 10% owned to be considered a differential, at least not in my opinion. Going into tonight, I'm recording this on Wednesday morning, we've got Brighton versus Man City. I own Julian Alvarez. I think he's just under 30% owned in the top 100k. That is still quite a big differential. I guess the players on this video are just even more differential than that. We will cover lots of other players in the game week preview, team selection, final thoughts, etc. The other thing to say is this is really based around overall rank. If you're someone that's looking mainly at mini leagues, then that's a little bit different. If you're in second place and you're trying to catch the person in first, and I know it's an extreme example, but let's say they don't own Erling Haaland, and you know he's going to start in game week 38, and you've got him, well, he's a massive differential over someone that doesn't have him. Similar with like a Bruno Fernandes. If you've got Bruno Fernandes in second place, and the person in first doesn't, that's a huge differential for you, even though for overall rank, that's not necessarily the case. So people in mini leagues really need to look at their own mini leagues to decide who is a differential. I can't really help you with that. The one thing I will say is I'm not really discussing in this video players to sell, but again, we can talk about that in other videos. This is really just differentials. Not everyone on this list I think is a great option to buy, but I want to talk about them anyway. Some players will only become options if other players get injured or we get team leaks and stuff like that. So that's all the information out of the way that you need for this video. If you enjoy it, give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's jump into it. So there's lots of ways that I could have ordered the players. In the end, I decided to group those playing for the same team together because it's just easier to talk about them as one. And I've only included midfielders and forwards anyway. So if we want to talk about any defenders, we can do that in other videos. Now, if you need a cheap forward this week, a lot of people are going to be looking at Domagoj. Just got a couple of goals against Spurs, only cost 5.6 million. And with Tony out of the picture, he should also be first choice penalty taker as well. The only thing kind of against him in game week 38 is the fixture, Man City at home, but perhaps it's not the worst time to play them with the amount of rotation that we saw against Chelsea. Could that continue for the final two games? The only issue is, even when City put out their kind of B team, the squad is so good, they're so well drilled, that's still going to be a tough fixture. So if you need someone 5.6 million or below, and you really fancy going for Mbama, I wouldn't really strongly argue against it or anything like that, because there's not a huge amount of cheap forward options, but he's not someone that I would go out of my way to target. Definitely someone to consider for next season, because obviously Tony is banned, and if he's going to be first choice penalty taker and quite cheap, potentially an option. But for game week 38, he's okay, but I wouldn't be looking to go out of my way to kind of bring him in. With Man City, as always, it's all about who's going to start, and it's very difficult for me to make that prediction based on what happened against Chelsea. The only thing I will say, I just don't believe that the kind of first choice starting 11, the likes of Haaland, Grealish, Bernardo Silva, Gundogan, Rodri, etc., will miss all three games. I just don't see that happening because there's a long gap between the Real Madrid semi-final and the FA Cup final. I think for match rhythm and match fitness, Pep will give them at least one start. It could be that they come off early, 45, 50, 55 minutes or something like that, but I'd be surprised if they don't start. So as much as I don't want to make a prediction, I guess based on what happens against Brighton, we can maybe try and figure out who plays against Brentford. So if Foden starts against Brighton, he's probably got less chance to play against Brentford, and obviously then vice versa. For what it's worth, apart from Haaland, pretty much every single Man City attacker is somewhat of a differential. De Bruyne, Foden and Gundogan are just the lowest owned. I think with De Bruyne, he's very difficult for most people to get in. I think the minutes would be too much of a concern. I'd rather have like a Salah, maybe a Haaland or a Kane or even a Son instead. But Foden and Gundogan are much easier to fit in. So I think for most of us that are still kind of tempted to get a Man City player, you've almost got to wait for that team leak. It feels just too risky to do it without it. And I know not everyone is going to be able to be around at the deadline, so I think for the most part, I would maybe just consider avoiding them unless you're confident based on what happens against Brighton. Then we've got Leeds versus Spurs. Now, Leeds need to win this game to have any chance of staying up. A draw won't be enough because of the points that Everton have. That being said, I don't necessarily think it means they go all out from the start to get goals. You only obviously need to win 1-0. You need to be careful you don't concede. Spurs have definitely got players like Kane and Son that can score against you. But if you want to go differential, the likes of Rodrigo and Bamford, 0.05% owned and 0.01% owned respectively. The only issue is they're both flagged. Now, it's such an important game. If there's any chance of getting them on the pitch, I'm sure they will play. But it does make them slight risks in terms of getting a reoccurrence of those injuries and having to go off early. So again, unless you're really tempted that Leeds are going to batter Spurs, I would probably just ignore them. Even the likes of Gnonto, you don't know if he's going to start at 4.7 million. And Harrison at 5.7 isn't bad. Right, I kind of like that price point, but he's up against someone like Eze, and it's very hard to make the case that Harrison is the better option. But if you want to go for Leeds, they have got a lot of differential options. I think on this list, apart from Liverpool players, Son and Kane are definitely my favourites. Kane is that one player over 10% ownership, but 14.49% for someone that scored 28 goals this season is still very low. And even if Sam Allardyce decides, you know what, we need to win, but we can't concede, we're going to try and be defensively solid, I'm just not sure that Leeds team can be defensively solid. So this game has got goals in it for Spurs. I really like Harry Kane as the obvious pick, but Son at 0.08% ownership, he has had, by his standards, a terrible season, but he's still got 10 goals. We know what he can produce. He is one of the biggest differentials this week, in my opinion, because you can be pretty sure that he's going to start. So if Salah wasn't fit, not fit. If we got a leak that Salah wasn't starting because top four was just off the table for Liverpool, which could happen, not saying it's that likely, but it could happen, the obvious move would be to shift Salah to someone cheaper and then put Kane up front. But if you just only got one transfer, or you really want to go big on the differentials, I really like Son as an option this week. I don't know if I would go as far to captain him, but if he went and got 2 or 3 goals, would it be that surprising given how good he is? Not really. So I think that game, I'd definitely be looking at Spurs players rather than Leeds. And then for Liverpool, it's a little bit like Man City, because they're playing a relegated side. Well, obviously, they're not. I know Man City aren't playing a relegated side, but Liverpool are. You really want to target them, but we can't be quite sure who's going to start. If Man United lose to Chelsea, then top 4 is still on for Liverpool. So I would expect Gakpo to play as the number 9 and Salah at right wing, and then one of Diaz or Jota on the left. I think lots of people think Firmino is definitely going to get a start, but if top 4 is still on the cards, I don't think that will happen. But if Man United do draw or beat Chelsea, top 4 is secure and Liverpool will have to make do with Europa League, and then all of a sudden Firmino becomes much more likely to start, and that is a great fixture, right? And I know it's not at home, so it's slightly different, but you still want to go out on a high, and 0.03% ownership is just ridiculous. I do feel like with Firmino, he's one of those players in FPL that you've never really owned because there's always been other Liverpool options. And he also feels like one of those players that when you bring him in, he never returns. But he can go big on his day. So if we get word that he's going to start, or Liverpool don't have top 4 to play for, I think he will start that game. And that's a huge differential. If not, maybe look at someone like Gakpo. I think on the left it's difficult because Diaz has started quite a lot, so you can't guarantee that Jota's going to play. But obviously they're different positions. Jota's a forward and Diaz is listed as a midfielder in FPL. But again, for 0.13%, given what we know Diaz can do at 7.8 million, again, it's a huge differential. But if Liverpool don't have anything to play for, how will that match go? Will they be up for it? I guess it doesn't really matter because they're playing Southampton away, so it should be easy enough anyway. But they are definitely players that I've got my eye on. I think Son is great, but he's 11.5 million, so it might be difficult for people to get him in. For Liverpool players, it's much, much easier. And I think my top 2 would probably be Diaz and Firmino. But again, a lot of this is unfortunately going to rely on information from managers or possible team leagues. For a lot of these players, you have to be willing to take a risk, not only on a differential, but also on a start. But wait and see what happens in the Man United-Chelsea game, because if it's all over for Liverpool, I think Firmino gets a start there. So as I said on yesterday's video, Game Week 38, maybe more so than any other game week, is all about building those narratives. You have to decide how you think each game is going to go. And personally, I think it's just more likely that Arsenal do well than that they do badly. I think Wolves at home is a good fixture on paper. We know what the Arsenal attack is capable of. There's definitely room for a few goals here. And I also don't think, and I could be massively wrong about this, but I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of rotation. I think the likes of Trossard, Odegaard, Saka and Jesus that we would expect to start normally, especially with Martinelli out, will continue to start here, especially for the last kind of home game in front of the fans. Yes, it's been a disappointing end, but overall it's been a great season for Arsenal. No one expected them to finish second. So I think they'll all start. They might just be subbed off a little bit earlier than normal. If you think it's going to be one of those games where it is going to be huge disappointment, there is going to be massive rotation, or they're just not going to play well, then you should avoid it. My opinion is Arsenal will do perfectly fine in this game. In terms of ownership levels, all of the Arsenal attackers that you would usually expect to start are somewhat of a differential. Odegaard is the highest owned in the top 100k at 8.99%, but that is still very low. Trossard is 0.3, Saka is 5.56, and Jesus is 1.21. The reason I've put Nketiah on is because if we get a leak that Jesus isn't started and Nketiah is, we know what he's capable of, and basically no one owns him. So he's the ultra differential from Arsenal. I guess anyone would be really, like if Reece Nelson started or someone like that, you could look there. And if you want a kind of another narrative to go into the final week, Saka has just signed a new contract as well. So maybe you'll want to completely sign that off with a goal. And at 5.56 and on penalties, he's probably still my favourite. But when it comes to price, you can't really argue with Trossard or Odegaard. Crystal Palace are another team I really like this week. I think it's a great fixture on paper, Nottingham Forest at home. They got nothing to play for now. If you're going to buy Crystal Palace players, you're hoping that Nottingham Forest have been partying all week, given that they're going to be in the Premier League again next season. Eze is the obvious one to go for. I'm actually a little bit surprised his ownership is so low at 6%, but obviously Palace haven't had double game weeks and stuff like that, so it kind of makes sense. That ownership will grow this week, but he's still a great option. I don't mind Elise, but there's no way I would go for him if I had the money for Eze. I just think he's much more likely to get you an assist, and we want goals where we can get them. So Elise is not a bad option at 5.3 or below, but I think Eze is the pick for Crystal Palace. And I wouldn't completely write off Edouard either. If Zaha is still out, which it looks like he probably will be, Jordan Ayew should play on the left, which means Edouard will play through the middle. Got a great goal in the last game. And essentially his minutes are just much better with Zaha out of the picture. And for 5 million for a forward that's got a great fixture on paper, I think he looks pretty good. This is not like massive hindsight because he scored, but last week when I wasn't sure about Alvarez, and I'm glad I brought him in the end, he was one of the players I looked at. I think Zaha is kind of the thing that makes Edouard viable. If he was fit, then he'd probably be back out of the team again. So keep an eye on the team news there. He could be an option. I think with the Nottingham Forest players, obviously Awoniyi's in a bit of form right now. Gibbs White is playing well too. I just don't know if it's a great kind of time to bring them in. It is the fixture, Palace versus Nottingham Forest, that could have a few goals from both teams, a bit like Palace and Fulham in Game Week 37. But I just think the job's done now. It has been a huge fight for them this season to kind of stay up. That's probably fatiguing both from a physical and a mental point of view. I mean, they are cheap at 5.6 and 5.5, so I wouldn't like begrudge anyone to bring them in, but I think I would rather go for the players from Crystal Palace instead. With Everton, they don't have to win to stay up, but if they win, it's in their hands, because if they draw and Leicester beat West Ham, Leicester would then stay up on goal difference. So Everton have to try and get the win to make sure they secure Premier League football, and I think the fixture is good. Bournemouth are a team that I always expect to score goals. They're also a team that are completely safe, not a lot to play for. There's going to be a lot of fight in those Everton players. I just worry that if Calvert-Lewin is out, and it's highly likely because I think he went off with a hamstring issue in Game Week 37, does that mean their goal threat goes down? Now, I still think they've got the fixture, which means you could look at them, But I think with Calvert-Lewin not there, it does make them quite a lot worse. We also are not going to know, unless Sean Dyche gives us some indication or we get a team leak, and most people are not looking for Everton news, who's going to start up front. Will it be Maupay, or will he put Demarai Gray in instead? So the ownership levels look really nice for some of those players, but it's so difficult to know who's going to play. If Calvert-Lewin is ruled fit, I'd be very surprised if he doesn't start. But then it's a bit like Rodrigo and Bamford, that if they've picked up a knock in 37, how many minutes will they be able to make through in game week 38? So Calvert-Lewin was someone that I really wanted to bring in this week, but I just don't think I can now. If you want to go for one of the better attackers, it's probably McNeil, but I just think outside of Calvert-Lewin, as good as the fixture is, I think that injury would probably put me off everyone else. But if you're going for an Everton player, let me know down in the comments below. And then with Solanke, again, another good option at 5.6 million on penalties, pretty nailed on. But I just think with Bournemouth, they might start trying something new. They might bring a few different players in just to give them some Premier League experience and stuff like that. I think he's been great this season for a lot of people. I owned him between game weeks 9 and 16. I just think it's probably the wrong time to bring him in. I'd rather go for someone with a home fixture like Edouard against a team with nothing to play for, or maybe even Mbomo against Man City, who may rotate a little bit. So I don't hate Solanke by any stretch, but I think there's other forwards I would go for, and I just really wish Calvert-Lewin was fit, because he was going to be my differential punt this week. So I like the idea of bringing in a Leicester forward this week, but I do wonder how much of that is just pure nostalgia. I keep thinking to myself, what if Jamie Vardy has one last party and it's game week 38 against West Ham at home? Could he get that brace or that hat-trick? Probably not, but if you want to target a Leicester attacker in a game where they need to win, where it might not be the worst time to play West Ham, we've got nothing to play for now, one eye on their European final, Vardy is the one getting the minutes at the moment. If you look at recent game weeks, he played 62 against Newcastle, 90 against Liverpool, 75 against Fulham and 90 against Everton. Iheanacho has only played 45 minutes in the last 4 games, and Daka is basically always used as a sub. So without a team leak, we have to assume Jamie Vardy is going to start. He's not cheap. Most people are not going to bring him in, but he's only 0%. He's basically 0% owned in the top 100k, and he's got a fairly good fixture this week. And like I said, Leicester have got to go and win. I wouldn't completely rule Maddison out either. I know he didn't start against Newcastle, but I'd be very surprised if he's benched again against West Ham in a game they need to win. He would take a lot of the set pieces. I think he might even be first choice penalty taker at this point. So for 7.8 million, don't completely forget about him. With West Ham, I guess it all comes down to how much will they rotate. They've got a little bit of time until their European final, but David Moyes might want to just take no risks. So without knowing who's going to start, it's probably not worth going for like a Bowen or a Benrahma or even an Antonio. But Danny Ings, right, if they do want to rest Antonio for the final, Danny Ings is only 0.05% owned. And yes, Leicester need to win. And Dean Smith might think, okay, we can nick a goal because of how good our attack is. We'll make sure we're solid defensively, like against Newcastle. The problem is they weren't solid defensively. They should have conceded. And that Leicester defence can just not be good. So I think even if... I just think they don't have it in them to put in a good defensive performance, is what I'm trying to say. So even if West Ham do rotate, Danny Ings should get a start and see pretty good minutes. I think if we look at his recent games, which I'll just pull up here, obviously Antonio hasn't started the last 2. He's played 90 against Leeds and 82 against Brentford. Now, to be fair, his numbers are not looking that great. 0.15 XG against Leeds, 0.05 against Brentford. But Leicester is the kind of fixture where you could go and get yourself a goal or two. So I don't completely hate Danny Ings either. I think for Man United, a lot will depend on what happens against Chelsea. If top 4 is secure, we may well see some rotation. Lots of people talking about Garnacho. If he does start, he's only 4.1 million. Ten Hag has kind of talked in the past how right now he sees him maybe more as an impact sub. I think Garnacho is one for next season where he may see more minutes. But obviously if Rashford is fit and Martial ends up starting, then that's your left winger and your striker sorted. There's no room for Garnacho. He's probably not going to go and play on the right. So it might just come down to what happens against Chelsea. But if he does start, I really like him as a cheap enabler. Again, if you wanted to go to like a Harry Kane, or you wanted to sell Salah or Salah to Garnacho, any forward to Harry Kane would then work. And Martial, look, if he starts, you would hope he would get past 60 minutes, but it's not a guarantee. And again, if he plays against Chelsea and they win, I think he'll just be rested for the FA Cup final. So I've put him on there because people might be thinking about him. It's just not where I would go. Willian and Mitrovic in particular, a lot of people talking about the revenge for the FA Cup final. I do get it. I think Man United defensively, most clean sheets so far this season. They have been pretty solid. I don't think it's a great fixture to bring Mitrovic in for. Man United may well rotate. Someone like Harry Maguire might start, for example, and that might make you feel better for going for it. And look, Mitrovic is never going to be a bad option because when he starts, he gets good minutes. We know he's on penalty still because he took the last one Fulham had. I just don't think he's the forward that I would look to bring in this week. I'd almost go as far to say, if you knew or you had a good instinct that Ings was going to start, I think I'd just rather take the punt there. Maybe I'm a little bit biased towards Man United, take that into account for sure. But again, I guess on the flip side, you're not really likely to get a Mitrovic owned by 0.17% of the top 100k. So if you want to take that punt, go for it. With Aston Villa, just to finish off, they got Brighton at home. I think Brighton, again, I said the other day, they've been hit and miss, right? They beat Arsenal to 0. They go and beat Southampton fairly comfortably, but they get smashed by Everton and Newcastle. I think this is a game where Aston Villa obviously need to win because I think they're trying to get into the Europa Conference League. I think you've got to finish 7th for that. So that is not a guarantee for them. We've talked about a lot of forwards in this that are differential. If you want a solid pick that you know is going to be good, that's got a decent-ish home fixture, then you can't really go wrong with Ollie Watkins. A lot of us owned him a few weeks ago. That ownership has come right down. He may or may not still be on penalties because he missed the last one, but his ownership is pretty low for a player that we know what he's capable of. And I just don't think... I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way... I've said this for a few games now. Go out of my way to target Brighton, but I don't think it's a fixture that would massively put me off. And if you do need a cheap midfielder and you're not sure about like a Garnacho punt, then Ramsey at 0.16 is a massive differential and his price is pretty decent as well. And then last player is Ferguson. Again, wait and see what happens against Man City, but I've got a feeling that Ferguson will start against Southampton, which he did. He'll be benched against Man City, and then he'll probably start the final game against Villa. And for 4.6 million, that's about as cheap as you're going to get for someone that's going to start and is also a huge differential. For what it's worth, Enciso is only about 6% owned, so you could look at him as well. But at that point, there wasn't enough room on the graphics. So I've just gone for Ferguson. I'm back in the Irishman. And yeah, so my favourite punts all around on this screen at least. I think Vardy, if you want to have some kind of real fun in terms of a kind of more old school pick that could do really well but hasn't done great recently. Garnacho if he starts. I quite like Danny Ings if he plays as well. Ferguson is just a great price. I like Arsenal players and Crystal Palace players in particular. So I think they've both got good home fixtures. We won't see a huge amount of rotation and they'll both, I don't know, score a few goals. I could be completely wrong. Let me know in the comments below. Like, I'm wrong quite a lot. You should know this by now. Let me know in the comments below which of the differentials I've talked about are you likely to go for or you're looking to hopefully go for if you know they start. And is there anyone that I've massively missed out? Leave me a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And I'll catch you again tomorrow.